Life on a Viking longship was an extraordinary existence, one that balanced between the brutal and the beautiful, the terrifying and the thrilling. Picture yourself aboard one of these iconic ships, a vessel that would cut through the cold waters of the North Atlantic, its dragon-headed prow slicing through the waves with a speed that belied its massive size. Aboard this ship, time seemed both endless and fleeting. Days blurred together, the rhythmic sound of the oars pulling in unison, the wind that came in gusts that felt like whispers of ancient gods, and the saltwater spray that clung to every inch of skin. It was a life shaped by necessity, where every breath of air, every gust of wind, and every wave was a constant reminder of the harshness and unpredictability of the Viking world. The longship itself, both a symbol of Viking ingenuity and a vessel for their ambitions, was no ordinary ship. It was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, designed to sail swiftly across open seas, yet also navigate shallow rivers, allowing Vikings to strike from unexpected angles. On board, however, it was a different story altogether. The longship wasn't just a vehicle for raiding, trading, or exploration. It was a mobile home, a confined space where warriors, men and women, lived, ate, and fought. There was little room for comfort, and personal space was a luxury few could afford. You might find yourself sitting shoulder to shoulder with your fellow Viking, surrounded by the pungent odors of sweat, saltwater, and the remnants of the day's meals. The constant motion of the ship, the sway of the hull against the water, kept you alert, your muscles tense, your senses ever vigilant. And yet, despite these difficulties, life aboard the longship was marked by a sense of purpose and camaraderie that kept the crew united. The ship was more than just a means of survival. It was a lifeline. As you look around, you would see men and women preparing for the day's journey, sharpening weapons, maintaining the ship's intricate rigging, or tending to the most vital task of all, navigating the vast and unpredictable seas. To be a Viking was to embrace an intimate relationship with the water, with the skies above and the stars that would guide them when daylight faded. Yet, amid the adventurous spirit, survival was paramount, and every aspect of life on the ship was molded by the harsh realities of the sea. This would soon bring us to the heart of the Viking experience aboard these ships: hygiene, food, and combat. In the cramped conditions of a longship, hygiene was a constant battle. Imagine a day that begins in darkness, with the sea cold and unforgiving, and yet the crew must rise to take their place at the oars. With sweat already dampening their skin, there was no time for the luxury of personal care that modern standards might deem necessary. Instead, the Vikings relied on what little resources they could find to maintain a semblance of cleanliness. A strip of cloth or a quick splash of seawater would have to suffice for washing, as there was no fresh water to spare. For a Viking warrior, the body was something to be maintained as best as possible, but often this meant that hygiene was more about practicality than comfort. The absence of soap and towels did little to stop the warriors, who would often suffer from lice, rashes, and the pervasive smell of sweat and salt. Food, too, was a constant concern. The Vikings did not have the luxury of modern refrigeration or easy access to fresh produce. Every meal aboard the longship had to be carefully rationed and preserved. Salted fish, dried meat, and hard bread were staples, while vegetables and fruits were rare, often traded or gathered during stops along the way. The limited space on the ship meant that food had to be kept in tight quarters, and it was not uncommon for food supplies to become damp, rotten, or tainted by the salty sea air. Meals were simple and often lacked the variety that many would consider essential for a balanced diet today, yet it was enough to sustain the crew during their long voyages. To the Vikings, food was more than just fuel. It was part of their identity, a reminder of where they had come from, and a key to their survival. Then, there was the ever-present reality of combat. The Viking longship, while not designed for comfort, was perfectly suited for warfare. It was a vessel made for speed, for sudden raids, and for the strategic advantage that the element of surprise could offer. Combat on a longship was chaotic, close quarters, and often brutal. The confined space of the ship would make fighting especially intense, as there was nowhere to escape or take cover. Every Viking aboard the ship was a warrior, ready to defend their vessel and their lives. They trained for these moments, knowing that battle could erupt at any time. The tight quarters meant that combat was less about long-range strategies and more about immediate survival, about hand-to-hand clashes and desperate struggles for control. Yet, these hardships, the lack of hygiene, the scarcity of food, and the constant threat of battle, were part of what made the Viking journey so extraordinary. The Vikings were more than mere warriors. They were survivors in the truest sense of the word. They understood that every aspect of their existence, from the way they maintained their bodies to how they hunted and cooked, was tied to their ability to stay alive in the unforgiving sea. They had to adapt, innovate, and above all endure. Their longships, their unique understanding of survival, and their fierce determination were the tools that allowed them to carve their mark on history. The Viking longship was a place of both extreme hardship and extraordinary resilience. It was a world where survival depended on the constant, silent cooperation of every crew member. As the ship cut through the waves, moving closer to distant shores or launching into battle, every person aboard had a role to play in keeping the ship afloat, the crew fed, and the warriors ready for whatever came next. There was little room for error, and no luxury of time to indulge in comforts. The Vikings were constantly in motion, living in a state of alertness, facing each new day with determination and grit. And so, life on a Viking longship was not merely about sailing or raiding, it was about living with purpose in the face of adversity. It was about finding ways to sustain oneself and one's fellow warriors amidst the most challenging conditions imaginable. It was about the bond that formed among those who shared the space of the ship and the commitment to one another that was essential for survival. In the face of harsh seas, relentless battle, and the ever-present struggle for survival, the Vikings had learned to thrive, carving out their legacy not just through their victories but through their ability to endure the hardships of life on a longship. As we venture deeper into the Viking experience aboard their longships, we will explore how these remarkable people navigated the complexities of hygiene, food, and combat in one of the most extreme living environments imaginable. Each of these elements played a crucial role in their survival and success, shaping their stories and their place in history. The Viking longship was a remarkable piece of maritime engineering, crafted with precision and purpose. The design of this vessel was far from accidental. Every aspect of it had been carefully thought out to meet the needs of Viking raiders, traders, and explorers. It was a ship that was not just a means of transport, but a symbol of Viking ingenuity and resilience. Aboard a longship, one would feel the pulse of history underfoot, every plank and nail a testament to the skill of those who built it and the lives it carried across vast and dangerous seas. At first glance, the longship might seem like a simple, slender boat, but as you step closer, you begin to appreciate its complexity and the precision with which it was crafted. The hull was long and narrow, designed for speed and maneuverability. This made the ship incredibly versatile, capable of navigating both the open ocean and shallow rivers with ease. The keel was deep enough to provide stability in rough waters but not so deep that it would prevent the ship from entering the many fjords, rivers, and coastal areas that the Vikings frequented. This adaptability was one of the key reasons why the Viking longship was so feared by their enemies. It could travel virtually anywhere, allowing the Vikings to strike quickly and vanish before anyone could respond. The frame of the longship was built using overlapping planks of oak, a wood prized for its strength and resilience. These planks were carefully shaped and then fastened together using iron rivets and wooden pegs. The technique, known as clinker building, was both innovative and effective, allowing the ship to flex and bend with the waves without breaking apart. The hull was designed to be as lightweight as possible without compromising durability, and the result was a vessel that could carry a full crew and their supplies, yet still move with surprising speed. The ribs of the ship were spaced close together, providing extra strength, while the hull itself was coated with a layer of tar to protect the wood from the harsh elements of the sea. One of the most striking features of the Viking longship was its asymmetrical design. Unlike modern ships, which typically have a bow and stern that are mirror images of each other, the longship's bow was pointed, almost like a dragon's head, while the stern was flat. This allowed the ship to turn quickly, an essential feature when navigating the unpredictable waters of the North Atlantic. The lack of a traditional rudder meant that Vikings had to rely on a pair of side-mounted oars for steering, but the design allowed them to make sharp turns and maneuver quickly, whether they were chasing down enemies or escaping from danger. The longship was also a marvel of practicality when it came to carrying its crew. While there was little space for comfort or privacy, the ship was designed to maximize every inch of available space. The deck was narrow and crowded, with oarsmen sitting side by side, their oars dipping into the water in perfect unison. Above them, the mast soared, holding up a single square sail made of wool or linen, which was often dyed in vibrant colors to signal the ship's allegiance or purpose. The sail could be raised and lowered quickly, and when the wind was right, it would billow out, propelling the ship forward with impressive speed. When the wind wasn't favorable, the crew would row, using their collective strength to keep the ship moving. The Viking longship was also designed to be incredibly lightweight, allowing it to be easily carried overland when necessary. In an age before roads and highways, Vikings often had to portage their ships across land to reach different bodies of water. The longship's construction made this possible. Its low weight and streamlined shape meant that it could be lifted by a small group of people and transported across short distances. This ability to move the ship overland, whether across a stretch of land or through a narrow river, gave the Vikings a strategic advantage, as they could quickly bring their ships to new areas and catch their enemies by surprise. Another key element of the longship's design was its ability to carry both warriors and supplies, which was essential for the Vikings' raiding and trading expeditions. The ship's cargo hold was designed to be as efficient as possible, with space for weapons, food, and other necessities. This was a ship that had to serve many purposes. It was a vessel for war, a trading post on the move, and a home for the crew. The limited space meant that each member of the crew had to be resourceful, and the design of the ship facilitated this adaptability. The oarsmen, who sat in the lower decks, would row in silence for hours at a time, while the warriors, often seated above them, would prepare for the next raid, sharpening weapons and discussing tactics. The beauty of the Viking longship wasn't just in its physical design, it was also in the cultural significance of the ship itself. Each longship was more than just a boat, it was a symbol of Viking identity. The ships were often named after legendary heroes or gods, imbuing them with a sense of power and purpose. The dragon's heads at the prow were meant to strike fear into the hearts of enemies, while also honoring the Viking gods. The ships were adorned with carvings and intricate details, telling stories of Viking mythology and history. The longship was a moving piece of art, a reflection of the Viking spirit and their connection to the gods, the sea, and their ancestors. For the Vikings, the longship was both a tool and a sacred vessel. It was used in battles, raids, and explorations, but it was also an integral part of their burial rituals. The Vikings believed that a ship could carry a warrior's soul to the afterlife, and many high-ranking Vikings were buried in ships, sometimes with their possessions and even their servants. The ship was not just a way to travel, it was a passage to the next world. The Viking longship, therefore, was more than a technological feat. It was a symbol of life, death, and everything in between. As you stand aboard one of these ships, it's hard not to feel the weight of history pressing in. The longship was a vessel designed to survive the harshest conditions, to carry its crew through stormy seas, and to help them conquer distant lands. It was a vessel that brought together innovation, necessity, and culture, and its legacy lives on today as a testament to the Vikings' mastery of the sea. Every plank of wood, every rivet and nail, tells a story of a people who dared to sail beyond the horizon, to challenge the unknown, and to leave their mark on the world. The design of the Viking longship wasn't just about practicality, it was about spirit, courage, and the drive to succeed against all odds. A day in the life of a Viking aboard a longship was one marked by routines shaped by necessity and survival, where every moment required focus, effort, and cooperation. The life of a Viking on the open sea was harsh, but it was also deeply connected to the rhythms of nature. Every day aboard a longship was an unpredictable journey, a balancing act between the comfort of the familiar and the constant challenge of the unknown. As the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, the sound of the waves gently lapping against the hull would fill the air. The crew would begin to stir, their bodies conditioned to wake with the sun, their eyes blinking in the weak early light. They had little time for luxury or laziness, there was always something to be done. The day would begin before the sun was fully risen. The first task was often rowing, getting the ship moving, as the Vikings had no engines to rely on. Rowing in unison, with the rhythm of the oars synchronized in perfect harmony, was a skill honed through years of training. The sound of the oars dipping into the water and the creak of the ship's frame against the sea would become the backdrop of daily life. The Vikings aboard the ship had to move as one unit, their bodies working in time to the pulse of the ship. This was not just a matter of physical strength but of mental discipline, a way of life that demanded cooperation and teamwork. The rowers sat on wooden benches, their legs bent, bodies shifting with each stroke as they propelled the ship forward. The Longship was designed to be lightweight and agile, making it easier to row even for long periods. Yet, rowing was grueling work, especially during long stretches when the wind wasn't favorable. Each man or woman, depending on the crew's makeup, would alternate between resting and rowing, ensuring that no one grew too exhausted. The oars themselves were long and heavy, their shafts sliding in and out of the water with a smooth rhythm that had been perfected over centuries. The physical exertion was intense, and the rowers had to be strong, not just in body, but in mind. With every stroke, they had to remain focused on the task at hand, working in unison to keep the ship moving. As the day wore on, the rhythm of life aboard the ship continued. The oarsmen would row in shifts, while others on the ship would tend to the sails or look out for signs of land or other ships. When the wind picked up, the crew would raise the square sail, a massive piece of cloth made from wool or linen. The sail was one of the Viking longship's greatest innovations, allowing it to travel much faster when the wind was favorable. Raising the sail was a task requiring all hands on deck, as the massive sail had to be carefully unfurled, the ropes adjusted, and the sail braced against the wind. Once the sail was in place, the ship would pick up speed, cutting through the water like a knife, the wind howling in the sails as the Vikings sailed on toward their destination. The sound of the wind, the creaking of the ship's rigging, and the slap of the waves against the hull created a symphony of movement and purpose. Yet, while the ship might be moving faster under sail, the need for constant vigilance remained. The Vikings were always on the lookout, their senses attuned to the slightest change in the environment. The crew would take turns standing watch, scanning the horizon for signs of danger or opportunities. Whether it was a storm on the distant horizon or a potential enemy ship approaching, the Vikings were never far from the reality that danger could strike at any moment. The constant threat of attack meant that there was no room for complacency. Even when the ship was sailing smoothly, there was always the possibility of an encounter that would require swift action. During these long stretches of travel, the Vikings would also engage in the necessary tasks that kept the ship running. The rigging had to be maintained, the sails repaired if necessary, and any damage to the hull would be addressed as quickly as possible. The crew worked in shifts, always on alert, making sure that the ship remained in top condition. There was a sense of camaraderie on board, a bond forged through shared effort. Each person had a role to play, and the success of the voyage depended on everyone doing their part. Whether it was the warriors who prepared for the possibility of combat or the craftsmen who ensured the ship was in perfect working order, there was a deep understanding that the survival of the crew depended on their collective strength. Meals aboard the Longship were simple and sparse. The limited space and resources meant that the crew had to make do with whatever they could bring aboard. Salted meat, dried fish, hard bread, and preserved vegetables made up the bulk of their diet. The crew would often share what little food they had, huddled together in small groups, eating quickly and efficiently. The lack of privacy meant that meals were not leisurely affairs. They were practical, designed to sustain the crew for long periods without spoiling or requiring too much preparation. Fresh food was a luxury that was rarely available, especially during long voyages. The Vikings relied on the preservation techniques that had been passed down through generations, ensuring that they could carry enough food to last for months if necessary. Drinking water was a constant concern. Fresh water was scarce aboard the ship, and the crew would often ration it carefully. Most of the water that the Vikings drank was stored in barrels, but it was often brackish and not especially refreshing. In many cases, they would supplement their diet with mead or ale, which not only provided calories but also helped to stave off thirst. The Vikings' relationship with water was complex. While they were experts at navigating and surviving on it, they were also constantly reminded of its dangers, its scarcity, and its ability to wear down even the hardiest souls. As the day drew to a close, the crew would shift into a new rhythm, one of preparation for the coming night. The ship, always in motion, would continue its journey, its course determined by the wind, the currents, and the will of the crew. The night watch would be set, with a few sailors keeping an eye on the stars, the horizon, and the changing winds. The others would settle into their small sleeping spaces, the ship rocking gently with the waves. Sleep was a precious commodity aboard the Longship. There was little time for rest, and the conditions made it difficult to find comfort. The constant movement of the ship, the dampness of the air, and the closeness of the crew made sleep fitful at best. Yet, sleep was necessary, for tomorrow would bring more of the same, more rowing, more vigilance, more cooperation, and more struggle. Through it all, the Viking warrior's day was one of unrelenting purpose. Every moment aboard the Longship was shaped by the need for survival, by the drive to continue moving forward, to be ever prepared for what lay ahead. The daily rhythm of life on the Longship, rowing, sailing, maintaining the ship, guarding against threats, eating and resting, created a sense of community and resolve among the crew. It was a world defined by movement, by the steady rhythm of the ship against the water, by the tasks that kept the ship afloat and the crew alive. In this life, there was little room for error. Every decision, every action, was a matter of life or death. The Viking Longship, with its endless tasks and relentless motion, was not just a means of transportation. It was the heart of Viking life, a vessel that carried the hopes, dreams, and struggles of those who sailed upon it. And in the lives of those who called it home, the daily grind of survival was both a burden and a triumph, a testament to the strength, resilience, and unyielding spirit of the Viking people. Hygiene on a Viking longship was a constant challenge, one that became an unspoken part of life aboard the vessel. Life on the open sea was brutal, and the longship was no exception to the demands of survival. The tight quarters, the endless exposure to seawater, and the ever-present salt mist meant that personal cleanliness was often sacrificed for the sake of more urgent matters, like keeping the ship afloat or preparing for the next battle. The very nature of the ship's design, with its confined space and lack of amenities, made hygiene a struggle from the moment the crew set foot on board until the moment they disembarked. The first thing a Viking warrior, or any crew member for that matter, would notice upon boarding a longship was the lack of privacy. There were no separate quarters, no private areas for bathing or cleaning. The ship was a single space where every action had to be done in close proximity to others. If you were fortunate enough to be near the bow or stern, you might get a little more space, but the entire ship was essentially a shared environment. Personal hygiene, then, became something of a communal responsibility, or rather, a shared burden. With a crew of anywhere between 20 to 60 men, women, and children, the close proximity was unavoidable. And in these conditions, cleanliness was not an easy thing to maintain. Seawater, of course, was in abundance, but fresh water was a luxury on a Viking ship. It wasn't easy to carry enough fresh water for a long journey, and so the crew would often make do with whatever they had. Salt water, while it could be used for rinsing or washing off the worst of the grime, did nothing to remove the stench of sweat, the oils of the skin, or the accumulated dirt. The salt water would also irritate the skin, making it feel raw and uncomfortable, but it was all that was available. This was a daily reality for the Vikings, living in an environment where hygiene was always secondary to survival. Even washing with seawater was a rare privilege, as it was often reserved for the most necessary tasks, like cleaning hands or washing the faces of those about to fight in battle. The Vikings didn't have soap as we know it today, and thus had to rely on natural methods to keep themselves clean. Herbs and plants were used as basic remedies for cleaning the body, although these were rudimentary and not always effective. Often, the Vikings would use ashes or sand to scrub their skin, creating a rough exfoliant that, while effective at removing some dirt, didn't do much for the oils and odors that would build up after days or weeks at sea. The friction of sand and ash against the skin could be harsh, but it was often the only option available. They might also have used water from rain when they were fortunate enough to catch it, but this wasn't reliable and certainly wasn't enough to cleanse the entire body in a meaningful way. But it wasn't just the lack of fresh water or soap that made hygiene difficult. The very conditions of living on the sea, confined, damp, and constantly exposed to the elements, made it nearly impossible to stay clean for long. The Vikings wore simple, functional clothing, often made from wool or linen, that was designed to withstand the elements. These materials would get soaked quickly from the saltwater, and the constant exposure to wetness created an environment ripe for the growth of lice, fleas, and other parasites. Lice infestations were common, and their presence was an accepted part of life. The Vikings didn't have the luxury of baths or the means to eradicate lice the way we do today. They had to live with the discomfort, scratching at their scalps and bodies, and trying to make do as best as they could. Fleas and lice weren't the only problem the Vikings had to contend with. The damp conditions also fostered the growth of fungi and other skin ailments. Fungal infections, rashes, and sores were common, and the constant exposure to saltwater could aggravate any existing conditions. The Vikings didn't have medical knowledge like we do today, so many of these issues were treated with herbal remedies, or simply endured until they either went away or became worse. There was little time for self-care in the midst of raiding, rowing, and navigating the seas. Illnesses or infections could spread quickly among the crew, especially in such a confined space, and the Vikings had little means of controlling this. When one person became sick, others would often follow, and this could become a serious concern when the crew was already battling the physical tolls of the journey. Another aspect of hygiene that the Vikings had to contend with was food. The nature of their diet, preserved meat, dried fish, and hard bread, meant that food often left a residue on the body. The smell of stale food, salt, and sweat would cling to the crew, adding to the unpleasant aroma that often enveloped the longship. The smell of the ship itself, with its wooden planks, saltwater spray, and the constant presence of sea creatures like fish and birds, would compound the issue. These conditions created an environment where personal cleanliness wasn't just difficult, it was nearly impossible. Hygiene was a luxury that simply wasn't a priority on a Viking longship. Survival was. And yet, despite all of this, the Vikings did find ways to maintain some semblance of cleanliness and order. One of the more effective ways they dealt with the constant discomfort was through their personal grooming rituals. While bathing was rare, grooming wasn't. The Vikings were known for their attention to personal grooming, even in the most challenging conditions. They would use knives, combs, and other simple tools to groom their hair and beards. Long hair was often braided or tied back, while beards were meticulously trimmed and shaped. Vikings valued their appearance, and this attention to grooming helped foster a sense of personal identity and pride, even in the most trying conditions. When it came to the hygiene of the ship itself, the crew would do their best to keep the ship clean and free of vermin, though the constant exposure to the elements made this a difficult task. The crew would regularly check the ship for damage and ensure that the deck was free of debris. They might also try to clean out the storage areas where food and supplies were kept, although the reality was that the conditions inside these spaces were often damp and infested with rats or insects. Despite these challenges, the longship had to remain functional, and the crew did their best to keep things in order. The maintenance of the ship was, after all, as important as the hygiene of its crew. Without a seaworthy vessel, their survival would be compromised. Despite all the hardships, the Vikings developed a kind of resilience in the face of their unhygienic reality. They learned to adapt to the harsh conditions, finding ways to manage the discomforts of lice, rashes, and the pervasive smell of saltwater and sweat. The lack of cleanliness wasn't seen as an insurmountable problem, it was simply part of life on a Viking longship. It was a world where personal hygiene, while important, had to take a back seat to survival and success. The Viking warriors, men and women alike, understood that cleanliness was a luxury, but survival depended on much more than that. They had to endure, adapt, and find ways to thrive in the face of constant discomfort and hardship. This tenacity, this ability to press on despite the difficulties, was what set the Vikings apart and allowed them to become the legends they are remembered as today. The Viking diet aboard their longships was defined by practicality and survival. Food, for them, wasn't just something to sustain them, it was a lifeline, a crucial part of their ability to endure long voyages, face the challenges of battle, and continue their relentless exploration and raids. When one imagines the daily life aboard a Viking longship, food may not be the first thing that comes to mind, but in reality, it was a central aspect of their existence. The limited space on the ship, the long journeys, and the lack of refrigeration meant that what Vikings ate was determined by what could be stored, preserved, and consumed without spoiling. The Viking diet was primarily composed of preserved foods, as fresh produce was a luxury they could rarely afford during long expeditions. Meat, fish, and grains were the staples, and they relied heavily on techniques like salting, drying, and smoking to preserve their food for the long journeys ahead. Aboard the Longship, the food was as much about endurance as it was about sustenance, with every meal crafted to provide the crew with enough energy to power through the grueling hours of rowing, the excitement of battle, and the isolation of life at sea. Salted fish was perhaps the most common food aboard a Viking longship. The Vikings were skilled fishers and had access to the abundant waters of the North Sea, making fish one of the most readily available foods. But fresh fish, like other fresh foods, didn't last long in the humid and salty environment of the longship. As a result, the Vikings would dry or salt fish to preserve it. Dried cod, for example, was a common food staple that could be stored for months. The salt preserved the fish, and drying it further enhanced its shelf life, making it perfect for long voyages. It wasn't the most appetizing food by modern standards, but to the Vikings, it was an essential and reliable source of protein. The fish would often be soaked in water before eating to soften it, and sometimes it was boiled or stewed with other ingredients to add flavor. Alongside fish, dried and salted meat was another staple. Viking warriors and traders often relied on salted beef or pork, which could be stored in barrels for extended periods. Much like the fish, the salt acted as a preservative, allowing the meat to last for months without spoiling. The meat would have been tough, requiring cooking to make it more palatable. It might be simmered in a pot with water to create a stew or boiled to make it tender enough to eat. On occasion, when the Vikings managed to land on a new shore, they might be able to hunt for fresh game, such as deer or wild boar, but these opportunities were rare, and fresh meat was a luxury they could seldom enjoy while at sea. Grains, particularly barley and oats, were also crucial to the Viking diet. Barley was the primary grain used in Viking bread, porridge, and ale, and it was a reliable and versatile food. Barley could be stored for a long time, and it was often made into flatbreads that could be eaten with meat or fish. These flatbreads, although simple, were filling and could be eaten on the go. Vikings also made a type of porridge by boiling the barley with water or milk, and it was often eaten with whatever was available: salted fish, dried fruit, or a little honey if they were lucky. The oats, on the other hand, were often used to make a coarse kind of gruel or oatmeal, which could be eaten as a breakfast meal or as a filler in the middle of the day. In addition to these staples, the Vikings would occasionally rely on vegetables, though they weren't as common on long voyages. The Vikings grew crops such as onions, leeks, turnips, and cabbage, but these vegetables were generally only available when they were near land. On a longship, where space for fresh produce was extremely limited, these vegetables could only be eaten in the early stages of a journey before they spoiled. When available, they were a welcome addition to the mostly meat and grain-based diet, providing much-needed vitamins and nutrients to balance out the more monotonous meals. On rare occasions, Vikings might forage for wild plants or berries when they were close to shore, adding some variety to their diet. However, these foraging opportunities were few and far between, especially once they ventured farther from land. When it came to liquids, the Vikings didn't have the luxury of modern water bottles or the means to carry large amounts of fresh water. Fresh water was a valuable resource, and it was often stored in barrels or skins, but it was always limited. As a result, the Vikings often drank ale or mead, both of which were staples in their culture. Ale, brewed from barley, was an important part of the Viking diet. It was consumed daily, as it provided calories, hydration, and a small amount of alcohol to help pass the long, monotonous hours on the ship. Ale was often brewed in large quantities before a journey and kept in barrels aboard the longship. It was consumed both as a drink and as a source of energy. Mead, made from fermented honey, was considered a more prestigious drink, often reserved for special occasions or for those in high rank. However, it was a treasured beverage among the Vikings and would have been enjoyed during feasts or celebrations when the crew was not actively at sea. The limited variety of food on a longship meant that meals were often simple and repetitive, but the Vikings were no strangers to ingenuity when it came to their diet. When they had access to fresh food, they would eat whatever they could find, from fish caught during a brief stop to wild berries or edible plants they could gather on shore. But these opportunities were fleeting, and the majority of their sustenance had to come from what they had prepared beforehand. The act of preparing food for long voyages was an important one. Vikings would carefully plan and store their provisions, knowing that every meal had to serve a dual purpose, both to nourish and to last. Spices and seasonings were another luxury that was rare for the Vikings at sea. They relied mainly on salt and whatever herbs or plants they could gather when they were close to land. In some cases, they might carry dried herbs, such as thyme, sage, or garlic, to add flavor to their otherwise plain meals. These herbs could be mixed into stews or added to meat to make it more palatable. However, the reality of life on a longship meant that food had to be prepared quickly, and there wasn't much time or room for complex cooking. The Viking diet aboard the longship was one of necessity, adaptation, and survival. It wasn't a diet of indulgence or luxury, it was a diet that had to be practical, portable, and durable. Every meal was a carefully calculated effort to ensure that the crew had enough energy to continue their journey, whether it was for raiding, trading, or exploring. The preserved fish, salted meat, barley bread, and ale were not just food, they were symbols of endurance. They were what kept the Vikings alive during their months-long voyages, facing the dangers of the open sea, the exhaustion of battle, and the uncertainty of the lands they would encounter. Despite the monotony, despite the lack of fresh food and variety, the Vikings had a deep connection to their diet. It was their foundation, their strength, and their key to survival in the harsh, unpredictable world they navigated. Combat on a Viking longship was as much about strategy and survival as it was about bravery and ferocity. The longship, designed for speed and agility, was not just a vessel for exploration and trade, it was a deadly weapon, used to strike terror into the hearts of enemies across northern Europe. The Vikings were master sailors, but they were also ruthless warriors, and the sea became their battleground. Life on the longship was a constant readiness for combat, with every crew member prepared to fight at a moment's notice. Whether raiding coastal villages, engaging in naval battles, or defending their ships from attack, the Vikings' combat tactics were as swift and brutal as the ships they sailed. The Viking longship, while not large in comparison to later naval vessels, was perfectly suited for the type of warfare the Vikings engaged in. Its design, with a long, narrow hull and a shallow draft, allowed it to navigate both open seas and shallow rivers. This versatility meant that the Vikings could strike anywhere, from the shores of England to the rivers of Eastern Europe. The longship was built for speed, allowing it to approach a target quickly and then retreat just as fast, often before the enemy had time to react. This ability to launch surprise attacks, a hallmark of Viking warfare, gave the Vikings a significant advantage over their enemies. When they attacked a coastal settlement, the longship's shallow draft allowed it to land directly on the beach, giving the Vikings access to land-based targets in a way that few could counter. Combat aboard the longship was close quarters and chaotic. There was no room for maneuvering, no space for complex strategies. It was a fight for survival, with warriors fighting side by side, sometimes only inches apart. The crew would line up along the sides of the ship, their weapons ready, their eyes fixed on the target ahead. The air would be thick with the sound of oars, the clash of metal, and the roar of warriors. The Vikings were known for their fearlessness in battle, and aboard the longship, they fought as a single unit, each person understanding their role in the larger struggle. The weapons that the Vikings used in combat were as varied as the warriors who wielded them. The most common weapons were swords, axes, and spears, all of which were designed for close combat. The Viking sword, with its wide, double-edged blade, was a symbol of status and power. It was designed to cleave through armor and bone, and in the confined space of the longship, it was an ideal weapon for hacking through enemy ranks. The axe, too, was a popular weapon, often used with deadly precision in the heat of battle. The Vikings favored the axe for its versatility, using it to strike down opponents in close combat or to smash through shields and helmets. The axe could also be thrown, making it a weapon for both offense and defense. The spear was another vital weapon, and it was particularly effective in the close-quarters combat typical aboard the Longship. Spears were long and lightweight, designed for thrusting rather than throwing. The Vikings would use their spears to jab at enemies over the sides of the ship, taking advantage of the long reach of the weapon while staying out of the range of shorter blades and axes. In battle, the spear was a crucial tool for keeping opponents at a distance, allowing the Vikings to maintain control of the fight. Aboard the Longship, shields were essential for both defense and offense. The Vikings would line the sides of their ships with shields, creating a wall of protection that could be used to fend off enemy attacks. The shields were round, made of wood and metal, and often decorated with bright colors or symbols that represented the warrior's clan or family. The shields were not just a means of defense, they were also a weapon. During an attack, the Vikings would hurl their shields at their enemies, using them to knock opponents off balance or create openings for other strikes. In some cases, warriors would use their shields as a way to form a defensive barrier when boarding enemy ships, allowing their comrades to swing their axes or swords freely. The close-quarters nature of combat on a longship meant that the Vikings had to be quick and decisive in their attacks. There was no room for hesitation. As the longship sped toward its target, the crew would prepare for the onslaught, ready to board the enemy vessel or assault the shoreline. Boarding tactics were a hallmark of Viking warfare. The Vikings would use their speed and agility to get close to the enemy ship, then leap across the gap between the two vessels, axes and swords raised, ready to engage in hand-to-hand combat. Boarding parties were often led by the most experienced warriors, who would be the first to leap onto the enemy ship, clearing the way for the rest of the crew to follow. Once aboard, the battle would become a brutal exchange of blows. The confined space of the ships meant that there was no room for long-range combat. It was all about close-quarters fighting, where speed and strength mattered more than anything else. The Vikings' reputation for fearlessness was well earned in these moments. They would fight with everything they had, swinging axes, thrusting spears, and slashing with swords. It was a fight for survival, where the strongest and the quickest would win. In these close combat situations, the Vikings' tactical advantage was their sheer aggression. They knew how to use the confined space of the longship to their benefit, pushing their enemies into tight corners where their numbers and weapons couldn't match the Viking fury. While much of the fighting aboard a longship was physical, there was also a psychological element to Viking combat. The Vikings were known for their terrifying war cries and their ability to intimidate their enemies. The roar of a Viking warrior charging into battle could send fear through even the most seasoned opponent. On top of that, the Vikings often wore helmets and armor decorated with symbols meant to invoke fear. Their iconic horned helmets, while more symbolic than practical, were designed to make them appear more fearsome, and the warriors often painted their faces or wore elaborate clothing to further enhance their terrifying appearance. The combination of surprise tactics, brutal close combat, and psychological warfare made Viking raids highly effective. The speed at which the longships could attack and then retreat made them nearly impossible to counter. The Vikings knew when to strike and when to pull back, keeping their enemies off balance. The sight of a Viking longship approaching could strike terror into a coastal village, knowing that the warriors aboard were prepared to board the shore, loot, and pillage, and then disappear before a proper defense could be mounted. Even when not engaged in direct combat, the Vikings were always prepared for battle. Life aboard a longship was a continuous cycle of readiness, a constant sharpening of weapons and honing of skills. The crew trained together, working to maintain cohesion and coordination during battle. This sense of unity was critical in ensuring that, when the time came to fight, every warrior knew their role and their duty. In battle, there was no room for individualism. The success of the crew depended on their ability to fight as a collective force. In the heat of battle, the Viking longship became more than just a ship. It became a platform for aggression and survival. It was a place where warriors honed their skills and tested their courage, where every encounter could mean life or death. Aboard the longship, combat wasn't just a way of life, it was a statement. The Vikings weren't just conquerors of land, they were masters of the seas, and the longship was the instrument of their dominance. Whether raiding a coastal village, battling rival tribes, or fighting off attackers on the open sea, The Viking longship remained a symbol of their unstoppable ferocity and tactical brilliance. The Viking warrior code was a complex blend of personal honor, loyalty, and deep respect for leadership. The Vikings were known for their fearlessness and their ruthless efficiency in battle, but they were also bound by a strict set of unwritten rules that governed their actions both in combat and in daily life. These codes were not just about following orders. They were about understanding one's place within a larger social structure, a network of relationships and obligations that defined the Viking community. Whether on the longship or ashore, every Viking warrior was expected to adhere to this code, which was both a moral guide and a means of maintaining cohesion within the group. At the heart of the Viking warrior code was the concept of honor. For the Vikings, personal honor was more than a social construct. It was a matter of survival. A warrior's reputation was everything. It was not simply the result of his prowess in battle but also his ability to uphold the values of the Viking society. A dishonorable Viking, one who failed to live up to these codes, would be ostracized, often left behind in dangerous situations or cast out from his community. Honor was earned through actions, not words. It was demonstrated through courage, loyalty, and strength, and it was validated by the collective memory of the group. The sagas, which were the written accounts of Viking life and warfare, were full of stories of warriors who gained or lost their honor depending on their actions. These stories were not just tales. They were lessons for future generations of Vikings, lessons about what it meant to be a true warrior. A key part of the Viking code was the bond of loyalty that existed between warriors and their leaders, but also between the warriors themselves. Loyalty was not a one-way street. It was reciprocal. A Viking leader, usually a chieftain or a king, was expected to protect and provide for his warriors, ensuring they had food, shelter, and the opportunity to earn honor in battle. In return, the warriors were expected to fight to the death for their leader, offering their loyalty without question. This relationship was rooted in mutual respect. The Vikings believed that a leader's strength came not just from his personal ability to lead, but from the loyalty and respect he commanded from his warriors. A leader who did not uphold the code of honor, who did not protect his warriors or who failed in battle, could quickly lose the respect of his followers and, with it, his power. Leadership, for the Vikings, was not a birthright. It was earned every single day. Loyalty, however, went beyond the relationship between the leader and his warriors. It also existed among the warriors themselves. Viking warriors often formed tight-knit bonds with their comrades, especially on the longships. These bonds were forged through shared hardships, long, grueling months at sea, the constant danger of battle, and the knowledge that life itself could be taken in an instant. Brotherhood and mutual dependence were central to Viking life. The success of a raid, the victory in battle, or the survival of a journey depended on the strength of these relationships. A warrior could rely on his fellow crew members for support, and in turn he was expected to provide that same support in return. This mutual loyalty created a sense of unity and strength within the Viking ranks, one that was nearly unbreakable. In addition to honor and loyalty, another essential aspect of the Viking warrior code was the belief in courage. Viking warriors were expected to be fearless, to face danger head-on without hesitation or fear of death. This was not just a call for bravery in battle but a broader sense of fearlessness in life. The Vikings lived with the constant awareness of their mortality. They understood that death was an inevitable part of life, and for a Viking, dying with honor in battle was the greatest possible end. The idea of dying gloriously in the thick of battle was seen as a way to earn a place in Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, where the bravest warriors would feast and fight in the afterlife. This belief in a glorious afterlife motivated many Viking warriors to face their enemies with extraordinary bravery, knowing that their actions would echo through history. But courage wasn't just about fighting in battle. It was about standing firm in the face of adversity in all aspects of life. Vikings were expected to be resilient, to endure hardships without complaint, and to continue moving forward even when things seemed hopeless. On the longships, this meant facing the unpredictable seas and dangerous storms. The Viking ships, while swift and versatile, were not invulnerable. The warriors aboard knew that each journey could be their last, yet they pressed on, driven by the desire for wealth, glory, or conquest. In the face of sickness, injury, or death, the Viking warrior code demanded courage, and it was this courage that kept the Viking spirit alive, even in the darkest of times. The warrior code also extended to the concept of revenge, an integral part of Viking culture. The Vikings were notorious for their belief in the importance of avenging wrongs and settling scores. A Viking warrior who had been wronged or who had lost a loved one in battle was expected to seek vengeance. This was not just a matter of personal emotion, it was seen as a sacred duty. Revenge was the Viking way of righting wrongs and ensuring that honor was upheld. The sagas often tell tales of warriors embarking on journeys of revenge, sometimes spanning years, to restore their family's honor or to avenge the death of a friend or comrade. The pursuit of revenge was often brutal and relentless, but it was an essential part of maintaining the balance of justice in Viking society. The idea of justice in Viking society was a nuanced one. It was not a matter of law in the way that we understand it today, but it was a system of social order based on honor and personal responsibility. Viking laws were often passed down orally, and each community had its own customs and traditions, but the warrior code held that each person was responsible for their actions. If a wrong was done, it was up to the individual and often the family to take matters into their own hands and restore the honor lost. While this sometimes led to cycles of violence and blood feuds, it also maintained a sense of balance in Viking society, where the strongest and most honorable warriors were revered and the weak or dishonorable were shunned. While the warrior code of the Vikings was built around honor, loyalty, courage, and justice, it was also shaped by the concept of leadership. Viking leaders were not just powerful figures, they were figures of respect, chosen by their followers for their ability to lead and to embody the warrior code. Leadership in Viking society was often a reflection of a person's ability to lead by example, to show courage in the face of danger, and to make decisions that ensured the survival and success of the group. A good Viking leader was someone who could command respect, not through fear or authority, but through actions that demonstrated honor, loyalty, and bravery. Viking leaders, especially chieftains or kings, had to be able to inspire their warriors, to show them that their leadership was worth following. They were expected to make difficult decisions, whether in battle or in matters of the tribe. The best leaders were those who could gain the trust of their warriors, who led from the front, and who understood that leadership was a shared responsibility. Viking leaders were often warriors themselves, individuals who had earned their status through valor in battle, through cunning in raids, and through their ability to lead their men in the most difficult of circumstances. Ultimately, the Viking warrior code was not just a set of rules, it was a way of life, a framework for understanding the world and one's place in it. It governed everything from how a warrior behaved on the battlefield to how he interacted with his comrades and his leaders. It was a code that valued personal strength and courage but also emphasized the importance of loyalty, honor, and the bonds of brotherhood. The legacy of this warrior code is still evident in the stories and sagas that survive to this day, tales of men and women who lived and died by the values that defined their society. The Viking warrior code, at its core, was about respect. The respect earned through actions, the respect given to others, and the respect demanded from those who lived and died by it. It was this code that allowed the Vikings to become the legendary figures they are remembered as today. Viking navigation was nothing short of remarkable, a testament to their unparalleled skill, resourcefulness, and connection to the natural world. The Vikings were not just warriors, they were expert seafarers, capable of traversing vast and treacherous seas using methods of navigation that were both sophisticated and deeply tied to their environment. While they lacked the modern tools and instruments we rely on today, the Vikings developed their own ways of reading the world around them, allowing them to travel great distances, from the icy waters of the North Atlantic to the warm shores of the Mediterranean, and even as far east as Constantinople. Viking navigation was an art honed over centuries, and it played a critical role in their ability to raid, trade, and explore the far reaches of the known world. The Vikings had a deep understanding of the sea, and their ships, particularly the Longship, were perfectly suited for the type of navigation they employed. The Longship's shallow draft allowed it to navigate in both deep ocean waters and the shallow rivers that wound through Europe. But it wasn't just the ships that made Viking navigation successful, It was the way the Vikings used the natural world to guide them, interpreting the winds, the sun, the stars, and even the behavior of birds and waves to find their way across the oceans. They didn't have compasses or maps in the modern sense, but they had an intimate knowledge of their environment, one passed down from generation to generation. One of the most critical aspects of Viking navigation was their ability to use the sun to guide them. The Vikings relied heavily on the position of the sun to determine direction, particularly during the long summer days of the northern latitudes when the sun barely set. They could tell the cardinal directions by observing the sun's movement across the sky. However, navigating by the sun wasn't always easy, especially on cloudy or foggy days, which were common in the North Atlantic. To address this, Vikings used a tool known as a sunstone, a crystal that could polarize light and help them determine the direction of the sun, even when it was hidden behind clouds. The sunstone's ability to filter out polarized light allowed the Vikings to see where the sun should be, even in poor visibility, helping them stay on course. The Vikings also relied on the stars to navigate at night. The starry sky, particularly the North Star, played a key role in helping the Vikings maintain their orientation when the sun was absent. The North Star, or Polaris, is located almost directly above the North Pole, and for the Vikings, it was a fixed point in the sky that indicated true north. By observing the North Star's position, the Vikings could determine their heading, even in the vast emptiness of the open ocean. The North Star served as a guiding light, a constant in a world that could otherwise feel disorienting and unpredictable. But it wasn't just the stars that helped guide the Vikings. They also paid close attention to the natural world around them, the behavior of birds, the direction of the wind, the movement of the waves. These subtle clues were critical for navigating the seas. The Vikings would often use seabirds, particularly ravens, as indicators of land. Ravens are known to fly long distances in search of food, and if they saw a raven flying in a particular direction, they would follow it, knowing that it was likely heading toward land. This practice was so important to the Vikings that the raven became a symbol of their culture, often appearing on their shields and banners. The bird's flight patterns provided the Vikings with a direct connection to the land, helping them pinpoint their location even in the vast open ocean. Wind patterns were another vital aspect of Viking navigation. The Vikings were keenly aware of prevailing winds and how they could be used to their advantage. They knew when and where the winds were most likely to blow, and they timed their voyages accordingly. Viking ships were designed to be sailed both with the wind and against it, but understanding the direction and strength of the wind could make the difference between a successful voyage and disaster. The Vikings often planned their journeys around the best wind patterns, using favorable winds to sail swiftly toward their destination and adjusting their course when the wind turned against them. In some cases, the Vikings would wait out unfavorable winds, using this time to rest or resupply before continuing their journey. While much of Viking navigation was based on natural signs, the Vikings also developed more structured methods to record their routes and directions. One such method was the use of landmarks, which helped guide them along known routes. On the open sea, the Vikings relied on a system of sea marks, distinctive natural features such as mountains, rocks, or coastal cliffs, that could be seen from a distance and acted as waypoints on their journey. These landmarks were crucial in coastal navigation, especially when approaching unfamiliar shores. The Vikings would memorize these landmarks, using them to navigate through narrow passages, into fjords, or along the coasts of faraway lands. Additionally, Viking sailors often relied on their extensive oral traditions to pass down navigation knowledge. These stories, passed from one generation to the next, contain descriptions of sea routes, landmarks, and other essential pieces of navigational information. These oral maps were a way for Viking sailors to learn the key routes and paths that had been used by previous generations. In a culture that had no written language for much of its history, oral tradition was a critical way of preserving knowledge, including navigational expertise. The stories would often be woven into the sagas, which chronicled the journeys, exploits, and adventures of Viking explorers and warriors. Despite the lack of modern technology, Viking navigation was incredibly effective. The Vikings were able to travel thousands of miles across open ocean, from Scandinavia to the British Isles, Iceland, Greenland, North America, and even parts of the Mediterranean. Their ability to navigate the vast distances between these places speaks to their incredible skill and knowledge. They weren't just sailors, they were pioneers, pushing the boundaries of the known world, and their longships were the perfect vessels for this type of exploration. The ships were fast, maneuverable, and could carry enough supplies for long voyages. Their shallow draft allowed them to enter shallow rivers, which made them ideal for both open sea exploration and inland raids. The Vikings didn't just navigate for the sake of exploration, they navigated for conquest, for trade, and for the expansion of their empire. Every journey they made was purposeful, whether it was to raid a coastal settlement, establish a trading post, or colonize a new land. Viking exploration led to the establishment of settlements in Iceland, Greenland, and even Newfoundland in North America, lands they reached nearly 500 years before Columbus. Their voyages to the New World were a testament to their navigational prowess, as they sailed into unknown waters, driven by a desire for wealth, land, and glory. The Viking ability to navigate was also closely tied to their deep spiritual beliefs. For the Vikings, the sea was not just a physical entity, it was a living force, full of gods and spirits. They believed that the ocean was ruled by the giant sea serpent Jormungandr, and that the waters were home to creatures both benevolent and malevolent. Navigating the seas was as much about appeasing these forces as it was about using natural signs and skills. The Vikings would often offer sacrifices to the gods before embarking on a journey, seeking their favor for safe passage. This spiritual connection to the sea reinforced the importance of navigation in Viking culture and provided an additional layer of meaning to their journeys. In conclusion, Viking navigation was a remarkable blend of practical skill and spiritual belief. The Vikings mastered the art of reading the natural world around them, using the sun, the stars, the wind, and the behavior of animals to guide their way. They crafted a deep understanding of the seas, creating methods and tools that allowed them to explore and conquer vast areas of the world. Their navigation skills were essential not only for their raids and voyages but also for the expansion of their culture. The Vikings were, in many ways, the original explorers of the North Atlantic, charting paths and leaving a legacy that continues to fascinate and inspire us today. Their ability to master the seas with little more than their wits and their ships was a triumph of human ingenuity and determination. The Viking social structure was a unique and deeply stratified system that defined the roles, rights, and responsibilities of each member of society. It was a culture where the line between noble and commoner could be blurred at times, where personal prowess and achievements could elevate one's standing, but where there were also clear divisions that defined one's place in the world. At the top were the rulers, kings, and nobles, whose wealth and influence came from land and power. Below them were the free men, farmers, traders, and warriors, who formed the backbone of Viking society. At the bottom were the thralls, the slaves, who had little to no autonomy but played a vital role in the functioning of the Viking economy and society. Understanding the roles and relationships within this complex social hierarchy gives us a deeper insight into how Viking society functioned and thrived, especially in the context of raids, wars, and the expansion of the Viking world. The highest class in Viking society was that of the jarls, the nobles and chieftains who ruled over large areas of land, commanded armies, and were often the most prominent members of Viking clans. The jarl was a position of great prestige and wealth, and those who held such titles were often descended from powerful Viking kings or warrior leaders. The jarls had the authority to command vast armies of warriors, many of whom were bound to them by loyalty and shared interests. These warriors, often free men, served their jarl in exchange for protection, land, or treasure. The jarl could also control trade routes and settlements, as well as influence laws and disputes within their territory. While the position of jarl was not strictly hereditary in the same way as monarchies in other parts of Europe, family lineage played a significant role in determining who would rise to these positions of power. The role of the jarl was closely tied to the concept of ing, the assembly of free men that was central to Viking governance. The ing was not a court of law in the modern sense, but rather a gathering where disputes were settled, laws were made, and the social fabric of Viking communities was maintained. While jarls often had significant influence over the ing, it was an arena where any free man could speak, and the law was meant to be upheld by the collective will of the people. This system of governance helped maintain order in Viking society, ensuring that even those without noble blood had a voice in matters that affected their lives. However, it was clear that the Jarls held the most sway, and their ability to wield power within the Ing ensured their continued status at the top of Viking society. Below the Jarls were the Carls, free men who made up the majority of Viking society. The Carls were farmers, traders, craftsmen, and warriors who had the ability to own land and possessions. They were the backbone of Viking communities, and their wealth and social status were often determined by the size of their land holdings and their ability to support themselves through their labor. A Carl's worth was tied to his productivity, and while he was not a noble by birth, his position was still considered honorable. The Carls had significant agency in Viking society. They could own property, participate in raids, and marry freely, and their social status could rise or fall depending on their actions. A Carl who became a successful warrior could rise in status, gaining land and wealth through his martial prowess. Conversely, a Carl who failed to provide for his family or protect his land could fall into poverty and be viewed with disdain by the rest of society. The Carls had a complicated relationship with the Jarls, as they were dependent on the nobility for protection and leadership, yet at the same time, they contributed significantly to the economic and military strength of Viking society. The Carls were the ones who worked the land, grew crops, raised livestock, and built ships. They were also the warriors who followed the Jarls into battle and formed the bulk of the Viking raids. In times of peace, the Carls would tend to their farms or engage in trade, often traveling to distant lands to barter goods and acquire wealth. This trade was vital to the Viking economy, and Carls who were successful traders could amass significant wealth, which further increased their status. The role of women in Viking society was also distinctive and was tied to their status as free women or slaves. Free women had a relatively high degree of autonomy compared to other cultures of the time. They were responsible for managing the household, taking care of the children, and maintaining the family's property while the men were away on raids or trade expeditions. Many women were skilled in textile production, including weaving and sewing, and their work contributed greatly to the Viking economy. In some cases, women even took part in battle. There are accounts of women who led armies or engaged in battle alongside the men, although such instances were rare. Viking women could also inherit property and wealth from their fathers or husbands, and they had the right to divorce their husbands in cases of abuse or neglect. These rights and responsibilities made Viking women much more independent than their counterparts in other societies at the time, although their social roles were still largely defined by their relationship to men. The lowest class in Viking society was the thralls, slaves who had no legal rights and were often captured in raids. Thralls were considered property, and they performed the manual labor necessary to maintain the Vikings' economy. Many thralls worked on the farms of Carls and Jarls, performing the most grueling and menial tasks, such as tending livestock, harvesting crops, or maintaining the household. Some thralls were skilled workers, such as blacksmiths, carpenters, or weavers, and could be sold to other Viking families or even used for trade. In fact, the Viking slave trade was a significant part of their economy, with thralls being sold in markets as far away as the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. Though thralls were at the bottom of the social ladder, they still had a role to play in Viking society. They were essential to the Vikings' ability to raid, farm, and maintain their settlements. However, their status was far from enviable. They had no freedom and were subject to the whims of their owners. Thralls could be freed under certain circumstances, such as if they performed extraordinary service or if they were able to buy their freedom. In some cases, a thrall might be adopted into a family or become part of the warrior class, but these instances were rare and required exceptional circumstances. Despite the rigid social structure, there was room for mobility, especially within the Carl class. Viking society valued martial prowess, wealth, and trade, and it was possible for a successful warrior or trader to rise from humble beginnings to the ranks of the Jarls. Conversely, even a Jarl could lose his status if he failed in battle or became discredited in the eyes of his warriors. This fluidity within the ranks of the Carls and Jarls ensured that Viking society remained dynamic, driven by personal achievement and the shifting allegiances of the warrior class. The relationships between the different classes in Viking society were not always harmonious, and tensions could arise, especially during times of scarcity or warfare. Yet the structure remained largely intact throughout the Viking Age, providing a sense of order and stability that allowed Viking society to thrive. The Vikings' hierarchical system, while rigid, allowed for a great deal of flexibility and adaptation, ensuring that individuals could rise through the ranks based on their abilities, while still maintaining a sense of tradition and duty to the broader community. In conclusion, the Viking social structure was a complex and multifaceted system that defined the roles of every individual within Viking society. At the top were the jarls, noble leaders who commanded respect and loyalty from their warriors. Below them were the carls, the free men who made up the bulk of Viking society, contributing to both the economy and military strength of the Vikings. At the bottom were the thralls, slaves who performed the labor that allowed Viking society to function. Each class had a distinct role to play, and while there was a rigid hierarchy, there was also the possibility for movement, depending on personal achievement and circumstance. This social structure was essential to the success and expansion of Viking culture, allowing the Vikings to conquer, trade, and explore far beyond the shores of their homeland. While the Vikings are often remembered for their brutal raids and conquests, they were also skilled settlers and colonizers who established thriving communities in lands far from their Scandinavian homeland. Their settlements were more than mere outposts for plundering. They were carefully planned, sustained communities that reflected the Vikings' ability to adapt to new environments, interact with different cultures, and leave a lasting legacy across the European continent and beyond. From Iceland to Greenland, to the coast of North America, the Viking expansion was not just about war. It was about settlement, trade, and the establishment of new Viking societies in places previously unknown to their ancestors. The Vikings' interest in settling new lands was driven by a number of factors. One of the most significant was the limited resources available in Scandinavia. Overpopulation, scarcity of arable land, and the harsh climate led many Vikings to look westward and southward in search of new opportunities. The expansion was also driven by the same warrior spirit that made the Vikings so successful in battle. While raiding was a way to acquire wealth and glory, settling new territories allowed the Vikings to build long-term power, establish dynasties, and lay the foundation for new Viking kingdoms. Iceland was one of the first places the Vikings settled in large numbers. The island, located in the North Atlantic, had been sparsely populated by Norsemen before the Viking Age. Around the late 9th century, Norse explorers, most notably Norse chieftain Ingolfur Arnarson, began to settle there in large numbers, transforming Iceland into a prominent Viking outpost. Iceland offered fertile land for farming, along with abundant fish stocks in its surrounding waters. It was an ideal place for the Vikings to build a community and a sustainable way of life. The Icelandic settlers brought with them their culture, traditions, and legal systems. One of the most remarkable aspects of Icelandic Viking settlements was the establishment of the Alþingi, one of the oldest parliaments in the world, which was founded in 930 AD. The Alþingi served as a forum for resolving disputes, creating laws, and organizing social and political affairs, allowing the Icelandic settlers to govern themselves without a single ruler or king. The Alþingi was a reflection of the Vikings' ability to adapt their social systems to new environments, drawing on their experience within gatherings back in Scandinavia but adapting them to a more isolated, self-sufficient society. Iceland also became a center of Viking culture, learning, and myth-making. The sagas, which chronicle the exploits of Viking heroes, were written down in Iceland and have become one of the most important literary traditions in the world. These sagas not only preserve the stories of Viking leaders and warriors but also provide insight into the life and customs of the Viking settlers. The Icelandic settlers cultivated a strong sense of identity and independence, which would continue to influence Icelandic culture for centuries to come. To the west of Iceland, the Vikings set their sights on Greenland, an even more remote and challenging territory. Led by Eric the Red, a Norse chieftain exiled from Iceland, the Vikings established settlements on the Greenland coast around the year 986 AD. Greenland, despite its name, was far from a lush, temperate paradise. The Viking settlers faced harsh climatic conditions, with short growing seasons and frequent storms, But they were undeterred. They built their homes along the coast, relying on farming, fishing, and hunting to sustain themselves. They raised livestock, particularly sheep, and cultivated crops such as barley, oats, and rye. Greenland represented a remarkable achievement in Viking colonization. The settlers adapted to the challenges of the environment and managed to establish a self-sustaining economy. They also engaged in trade with other Viking settlements, particularly with Norway, Iceland, and even with the native Inuit population whom they encountered in the region. The Vikings also established a Christian presence in Greenland, with the first churches being built by the late 10th century. Greenland remained a Viking colony for several centuries, though it eventually declined due to a combination of environmental factors, changing climate conditions, and the pressures of isolation. Perhaps the most famous of all Viking settlements outside of Scandinavia was in North America. In the early 11th century, Norse explorer Leif Erikson, the son of Eric the Red, sailed westward from Greenland to what is today known as Newfoundland in Canada. He established a settlement called Vinland, which is believed to have been located near modern-day L'Anse aux Meadows. The discovery of Norse artifacts in this region provides archaeological evidence that the Vikings reached North America long before Christopher Columbus set foot on the continent. The Vikings' presence in North America was short-lived, however. Despite the initial success of their settlement, the Vikings faced significant challenges in maintaining a foothold in the region. They encountered resistance from native populations, and the harsh conditions of the land made it difficult for the settlers to survive. Additionally, the Vikings were likely unprepared for the difficulties of maintaining a distant colony. While the Vikings did not establish a lasting presence in North America, their brief occupation of Vinland represents one of the most extraordinary chapters in the history of exploration. In addition to these well-known settlements, the Vikings also established numerous trading posts and colonies along the coasts of Europe. In the British Isles, for example, Viking raids eventually gave way to Viking settlements in places such as York, Dublin, and the Orkney Islands. The Vikings formed alliances with local rulers, intermarried with local populations, and created new hybrid cultures that combined Viking customs with those of the indigenous peoples. In fact, much of what we know about Viking settlements in the British Isles comes from the blending of Viking and Anglo-Saxon cultures, as well as the legacy of Viking place names, language, and customs that continue to endure. Viking settlements in France also left a lasting impact. The Vikings began raiding the coasts of modern-day France in the 9th century, and over time, they began to settle in the region of Normandy. The name Normandy itself comes from the term Norsemen, or men of the north. In 911 AD, the Viking leader Rollo was granted land in the region by the Frankish king Charles the Simple in exchange for his loyalty. The Norse settlers in Normandy eventually assimilated into French culture, adopting Christianity and French language and customs. Over time, the Vikings who had settled in Normandy rose to prominence, with their descendants becoming some of the most powerful rulers in Europe, including William the Conqueror, who would go on to lead the Norman conquest of England in 1066. The Viking approach to colonization was not always one of conquest. It was also a strategy of integration, trade, and adaptation. While the Vikings did engage in raids and warfare, they were also skilled traders who established extensive networks across Europe, the Middle East, and even Asia. These trading routes connected Viking settlements to the wider world, facilitating the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies. Viking settlements in places like Kiev, Russia, and Constantinople became important centers of commerce, where goods such as furs, timber, iron, and amber were traded for silver, spices, and luxury items. This trading network was a key part of Viking society and allowed their settlements to thrive and become economically prosperous. The legacy of Viking settlements is still felt today in many parts of the world. From the rugged landscapes of Iceland and Greenland to the rich cultural heritage of Normandy and the British Isles, Viking settlements left an indelible mark on the societies they touched. Their stories of exploration, adaptation, and survival continue to inspire awe and admiration, reminding us of the courage and ingenuity of the Viking people. In conclusion, the Viking Age was not just a period of raids and warfare, it was also a time of expansion, settlement, and colonization. The Vikings established communities in some of the most remote and inhospitable regions of the world, adapting to their environments and building thriving societies. Their legacy as explorers and settlers is as significant as their reputation as warriors, and their impact on the lands they colonized is still evident today. The Vikings were not just conquerors, they were builders, traders, and pioneers who reshaped the world in their image. Through their settlements, the Vikings left a lasting legacy that continues to shape the cultures, landscapes, and histories of the regions they once called home. The Vikings were renowned not only for their martial prowess and naval dominance, but also for their extraordinary artistry and craftsmanship. Despite their reputation as fierce warriors, their ability to create functional yet stunning works of art is a testament to their skill, innovation, and cultural sophistication. Viking art was deeply intertwined with their daily life, religion, and the practicalities of survival. The Vikings' artistic creations ranged from intricately designed weapons and armor to delicate jewelry and intricate woodwork, each piece reflecting the values, beliefs, and aesthetic sensibilities of their society. Whether forged in the heat of battle or crafted for personal adornment, Viking art was never just decorative, it was also functional, with each piece serving a purpose in the harsh world the Vikings inhabited. One of the most iconic aspects of Viking craftsmanship is their weaponry. Viking swords, axes, and shields were not only instruments of war but also symbols of status and identity. The design of these weapons often incorporated intricate details and elaborate decoration, transforming them into works of art. Viking swords, for example, were meticulously crafted with iron and steel, and often featured ornate hilts and crossguards. The hilts of swords were sometimes wrapped in leather or adorned with gold or silver inlays, while the blades were carefully forged to ensure both sharpness and strength. Some swords were even inscribed with runic symbols, which were believed to imbue the weapon with magical properties or to mark the sword as the property of a particular warrior or family. The quality of a Viking sword was a reflection of the skill of the blacksmith, who was highly respected within Viking society. The process of forging a sword was labor-intensive and required a deep knowledge of metallurgy. Viking blacksmiths often used a technique known as pattern welding, which involved folding and twisting layers of iron and steel together to create a blade that was both strong and flexible. The result was a sword that could withstand the rigors of battle while also being a beautiful object in its own right. Viking swords were highly prized, and it was not uncommon for a warrior to pass his sword down through generations, making it an heirloom imbued with personal and familial significance. In addition to swords, Viking axes were also highly valued weapons, often used in both combat and everyday tasks. The Viking axe, with its distinctive broad, curved blade, was both a symbol of power and a tool for practical use. These axes were designed to be effective in battle, capable of delivering powerful blows to armor and shields, but they were also used for felling trees, building homes, and other essential activities. Like Viking swords, axes were often decorated with intricate carvings or inlaid metalwork, making them not only functional tools but also beautiful objects that reflected the skill and artistry of their creators. Shields were another essential piece of Viking equipment, and they too were often decorated with stunning designs. Viking shields were typically round and made of wood, with a central metal boss to protect the warrior's hand. The wooden surface of the shield was often painted with intricate designs, ranging from geometric patterns to depictions of animals, gods, or legendary heroes. These designs were not only intended to beautify the shield but also to serve as a form of personal expression or as a way of invoking the protection of the gods. Some Viking shields featured the wolf's head motif, which symbolized strength and ferocity, while others depicted the Thor's hammer, a symbol of divine protection. The Vikings also excelled in creating jewelry, and Viking jewelry is renowned for its intricate designs and high quality. Jewelry was worn not only for decoration but also as a symbol of status, wealth, and identity. Rings, brooches, necklaces, and pendants were all crafted with great care and precision. The Vikings often used silver and gold to create their jewelry, as well as semi-precious stones such as garnets and amethysts. Some of the most beautiful examples of Viking jewelry are the large, circular brooches that were worn by women to fasten their cloaks. These brooches were often decorated with intricate patterns and designs, featuring swirling motifs, animal shapes, and scenes from Norse mythology. The brooch was more than just a practical item, it was a way of expressing one's personal taste and cultural identity. The Vikings were also known for their use of rune stones, which were intricately carved stone monuments that featured inscriptions in the runic alphabet. These stones were often erected in honor of deceased family members or as markers of important events, such as the founding of a settlement or the dedication of a temple. The runes themselves were not just a form of writing, they were believed to have magical properties, and the carving of runes was an art form in its own right. The Viking runestones were often decorated with intricate designs that featured interwoven patterns, animal figures, and other symbols from Viking mythology. These carvings were not only functional but also deeply spiritual, serving as a connection between the physical world and the divine. Woodworking was another area in which the Vikings excelled. Given the importance of wood in Viking society, it's no surprise that the Vikings were skilled woodworkers. From the construction of their iconic longships to the building of homes and churches, the Vikings demonstrated an unparalleled mastery of woodcraft. The longships, in particular, were a marvel of Viking engineering and artistry. These ships were designed to be fast, flexible, and capable of navigating both open seas and shallow rivers. The craftsmanship involved in constructing a longship required great skill, as the shipbuilders had to carefully shape the wood to ensure the ship's durability and seaworthiness. The prow and stern of the ship were often decorated with intricate carvings of dragons or other mythical creatures, which were believed to protect the ship and its crew from harm. Viking longhouses, the traditional dwellings of Viking families, were also crafted with great attention to detail. These homes were built using wooden beams, thatch, and turf, and were often designed to accommodate extended families and livestock. The interiors of Viking longhouses were often decorated with carvings and paintings, which reflected the family's status and wealth. The Vikings also constructed smaller wooden temples and shrines to honor their gods, with many of these structures featuring beautiful carvings of Norse deities and mythological creatures. In addition to functional and decorative items, the Vikings were skilled at creating personal items, such as combs, knives, and tools, that were both beautiful and practical. Viking combs, for example, were often made from bone or wood and decorated with intricate designs. These combs were not only used for grooming but also served as personal adornments, reflecting the owner's status and taste. Viking knives were similarly crafted with great care, with finely carved handles and blades that were designed to be both effective and aesthetically pleasing. These personal items were often passed down from generation to generation, becoming cherished heirlooms that connected the owner to their Viking ancestors. Viking art and craftsmanship were deeply tied to the culture's spiritual beliefs. Many of the designs and motifs found in Viking art have connections to Norse mythology, the natural world, and the gods. Animals, particularly wolves, ravens, and snakes, were common symbols in Viking art, as they were believed to hold special significance in Norse cosmology. The wolf, for example, was associated with the god Fenrir, a powerful figure in Norse mythology, while the raven was a symbol of the god Odin. These animals were often depicted in Viking art as a way of invoking the god's protection or favor. The craftsmanship of the Vikings was not limited to the objects they created for personal use. They were also skilled artisans in the construction of larger public works, such as the great burial ships that have become synonymous with Viking culture. These burial ships, such as the ones found in the Oseberg and Gokstad tombs in Norway, were masterpieces of Viking artistry. The ships were intricately carved, with elaborate decorations on the prow and stern, and were designed to transport the deceased to the afterlife. The craftsmanship involved in constructing these burial ships was extraordinary, and the ships themselves were a testament to the Vikings' belief in the importance of the afterlife and the gods. In conclusion, Viking art and craftsmanship were an integral part of the culture, reflecting not only the practical needs of everyday life but also the spiritual and symbolic values of Viking society. From weapons and armor to jewelry, woodwork, and rune stones, Viking artisans created functional objects that were also beautiful works of art. Their craftsmanship was a reflection of their values, strength, honor, and a deep connection to the natural and spiritual worlds. The legacy of Viking art can still be seen today in the surviving artifacts, monuments, and the rich cultural traditions of the Viking descendants. Whether in the intricate design of a sword, the beauty of a piece of jewelry, or the craftsmanship of a longship, the Vikings' ability to combine function with aesthetic brilliance is one of the lasting legacies of their civilization. Viking religion and mythology were integral to the Viking worldview, providing both a spiritual framework and a practical guide to living in a harsh and unpredictable world. The Vikings, who emerged from the rugged landscapes of Scandinavia, held a deep connection to the natural world, believing that the forces of nature were governed by powerful gods and spirits. Their religion was polytheistic, with a pantheon of gods and goddesses who personified natural elements, human virtues, and the complexities of the cosmos. The Vikings' beliefs were not merely abstract ideas, they were deeply woven into the fabric of their daily lives, shaping their actions, decisions, and interactions with the world around them. From their reverence for the gods to their practices of sacrifice and ritual, Viking religion was an essential part of their identity as a people. At the center of Viking religion were the gods and goddesses of the Norse pantheon. These deities were not distant, all-powerful figures as seen in some other mythologies, but rather embodied forces of nature and human experience. The most prominent gods were Odin, Thor, and Freya, but there were many others, each with their own distinct qualities and domains. Odin, the Allfather, was the chief of the gods, ruler of Asgard, and the god of wisdom, war, and death. He was a complex figure, associated with both the joys of battle and the mysteries of the afterlife. Odin was not just a god of victory, he was a seeker of knowledge, willing to sacrifice even his own eye in exchange for the wisdom of the Well of Mimir. His quest for wisdom, often at great personal cost, made him a god revered by both warriors and scholars alike. Thor, the god of thunder, was another central figure in Viking mythology. Thor was known for his strength, bravery, and protection of both gods and humans. He was the defender of the realms, wielding his mighty hammer, Mjolnir, to defeat giants, trolls, and other supernatural threats. Thor was beloved by the Vikings for his down-to-earth qualities and his role as a protector. He was not a god of wisdom like Odin, but a god of action, whose battles were often seen as a metaphor for the struggle between order and chaos. Thor's role as a protector of the people was reflected in his association with fertility and agriculture, as the Vikings believed that his thunder ensured a good harvest. In this way, Thor was seen as a guardian of both the physical and the spiritual worlds. Freya, the goddess of love, beauty, and fertility, held a unique place in Viking religion. She was not only associated with romantic love and attraction but also with war and death. Freya was known to take fallen warriors to her hall, Sessrumnir, where they would feast until the time of Ragnarok, the prophesied end of the world. She was a powerful and independent goddess, and her myths reflected her ability to navigate both the domestic and the divine realms. Freya's presence in Viking religion underscores the Vikings' complex understanding of love, death, and the afterlife. She was a symbol of the dual nature of existence, where love and war, life and death, were often intertwined. In addition to these prominent gods, Viking mythology was filled with a vast array of other deities, spirits, and mythical creatures. There was Loki, the trickster god, whose mischievous actions often led to both chaos and transformation. There were the Valkyries, warrior maidens who served Odin, choosing which warriors would live and which would die in battle. There were the Jotnar, or giants, who were often in conflict with the gods, representing forces of chaos and destruction. The gods themselves were not invincible, they were often depicted as struggling with their own weaknesses and flaws, making them more relatable to the Vikings, who lived in a world where survival often depended on skill, strength, and cunning. The Vikings believed that the gods lived in Asgard, one of the 9 realms that made up the cosmos. The 9 realms were connected by Yggdrasil, the world tree, which stood at the center of the universe.